Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening and good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to this webinar on the topic disaster governance and prospects of interregional partnership in the Asia Pacific. I am delighted to introduce the speakers for this webinar, starting with Dr. Alistair Cook, who is the coordinator of the Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief Program and senior fellow at the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies here at Nanyang Technological University. Dr. Cook's research interests focused geographically on the Asia Pacific and Myanmar in particular, and thematically on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, foreign policy, and regional cooperation. The other speaker is Christopher Chen, who is our Associate Research Fellow, also at the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies. Chris's specialty is in the area of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and also on human rights in Asia, forced migration, institutional memory, conflicts, politics and conflicts in the Asia Pacific. Without further ado, may I now call on Alistair to start the presentation. Alistair, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So hello to all from wherever you are, from us here in Singapore. Chris and I have embarked on this project in 2019, and it led to us writing and producing a journal article titled Disaster Governance and Prospects of Interregional Partnership in the Asia Pacific. Now, in terms of our program and how this fits within our broader research agenda, the HADR program focuses on three core research pillars. We focus on the emerging humanitarian landscape, structures and mechanisms. Within that, we focus on the Asia Pacific, looking at 5 most at-risk countries, and that includes Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Indonesia, and the Philippines, plus an additional 2 which are close in proximity to us, that is Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste. And in 2019, this expanded to include Pacific Island states. The second area we look at is community protection and assistance, and this essentially looks at the exposure of communities to natural hazards and their ability to adapt and cope with disasters. And the third area focuses on the impact new technologies are having on this space. Our project is conducted under the NTU Institutional Review Board, and our project number is listed there on the screen. Next slide, please. So why are we looking at disasters? So we're in a region where around 80% of humanitarian assistance is distributed in disaster relief, compared to 20% which is distributed in response to those affected by conflict. This is a direct opposite, essentially, to what we see in the global humanitarian system, where 80% of humanitarian aid is given to those in conflict settings, and only 20% of the aid is given to those in disasters. So the Asia Pacific is particularly exposed to natural hazards. And as we've seen over the past several decades, is that the numbers tell us a very important story in terms of the impact that this region has had in terms of exposure to disasters. And you can see there that we've lost 2 million people, which is around 59% of the global death toll. Whereas we're looking at numbers which are averaging much less in terms of fatalities per year at the global level compared to what we experience in this region. However, there has been progress in this realm since the 70s. There's been a number of regional initiatives, national capacity has been built, and much cooperation has been developed in order to respond to sudden onset, particularly disasters. But there are a number of slow onset disasters which also require our attention. And what we're seeing is that as the impact of climate change is having on this region, these disasters are occurring much more frequently and in close timeframes to one another. So we're experiencing simultaneous as well as concurrent disasters. As we saw in 2019, the Philippines experienced a quick succession of typhoons, which impacted the ability to respond to them as they were still recovering from previous typhoons. Next slide, please. So what we'll be looking at today is the product of our research that we've been doing in this region over the past 6 years, and particularly on the research that we have conducted in 2019. So to go through some of those research findings and to explore this some more, I'll hand over to Chris at this point, and then I will rejoin the discussion later on in the presentation. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Al. Hi, everyone. So this is the article that has recently been published in the Pacific Review titled Disaster Governance and the Prospects of Interregional Partnership in the Asia-Pacific. Our research was largely informed by two core research questions. Firstly, what is the current disaster management landscape in the Southwest Pacific? And secondly, to what extent is there room for partnership between Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific, as well as what form should this engagement actually take? To answer these questions, we actually assess the disaster management frameworks and initiatives that ASEAN has institutionalized to see how they can actually complement the work of the Pacific Islands Forum. So in both regions, countries have actually built trusting partnerships through their respective regional organizations. So in Southeast Asia, we have the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. And in the Pacific, we have the Pacific Islands Forum, or PIF for short. Both regions have identified natural hazards and climate change as significant threats to regional peace and security. And it is actually through these regional organizations that the issues have been framed as a common security interest problem to member states. So therefore, our article actually argues for greater interregional partnership between the two regions that are both regions that are inordinately exposed to non-traditional security threats, with some of the common challenges such as exposure to storm surges and cyclones, as well as the effects of climate change. We argue that there are actually important opportunities for interregional partnerships in disaster management and climate security, and something which we collectively refer to as disaster governance. Next slide, please. So this is actually the methodology that we use in our research. The article is actually based on desk research as well as in-depth semi-structured interviews with humanitarian practitioners and academics in Fiji and Tonga. So for our desk research component, we conducted a literature review of academic writing, institutional reports, press releases, and as well as government policy documents on disaster management in both Fiji, Tonga, and the Southeast Asian region. And further to this, we conducted 36 in-depth interviews, 21 in Fiji and 15 in Tonga, which were conducted during our fieldwork in Suva, Fiji, and Nuku'alofa in Tonga, from the 20th of August to 6th of September 2019. Some of our interview participants included government and military personnel, personnel from high commissions, humanitarian workers from both international and local organizations, delegates from regional bodies, as well as members of faith-based organizations and academia. Next slide, please. Before we begin this discussion of our findings and our I think it is important to begin with some context of the region in question. So the Southwest Pacific is actually home to 15 small island states and approximately 2.7 million people, due to a combination of geographical location and socio-economic factors. States in this region are actually particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change and extreme weather events. Many of them are actually located close to the cyclone belt and are exposed to a high frequency of tropical cyclones, floodings, and storm damage. The economic realities of these island states in particular also make it harder for them to prepare for and recover from the impact of large-scale disasters, which might actually slow down or even regress socio-economic progress in the country, in different countries. So first up, we have Fiji. Fiji is an archipelagic country made up of more than 320 islands. Its land mass is a mix of mountainous and volcanic terrain, and situated in the South Pacific, Fiji has a population of around 880,000 people, of which roughly 56% of them reside in urban areas. And the majority of the population actually live on two of the largest islands, Viti Levu and Vanua Levu. After Papua New Guinea, Fiji is actually the second largest country in the region. And it is also one of the wealthier countries in the Pacific and is geographically and culturally the center of the Pacific. So it has historically served as the regional hub for banking services, communications, flights, as well as other shipping routes. However, despite its larger size and relatively more developed status, Fiji is actually still vulnerable to the impacts of external shocks and natural disasters and natural hazards. It ranks 15 out of 181 countries on the World Risk Index 2020, and as mentioned before, it is also widely exposed to natural hazards, particularly tropical cyclones. I think on average, it experiences about 15 cyclones every decade, and next slide, please. Thank you. So the other country that we are looking at is Tonga. Tonga is actually a very small kingdom that consists of 172 islands, of which only 36 are inhabited. It has a population of only 100,000 people, and only about a quarter of them reside in urban areas. So a lot of them actually reside in the outer islands as well. However, even with its relatively small population size, Tonga actually has a higher population density than Fiji. This is actually largely due to the small land masses of inhabited islands. As a small island developing state, Tonga's trade potential is actually severely hampered by its remoteness and insularity. And as with the other Pacific island states, Tonga is also largely affected by rising sea levels and tropical cyclones. It actually ranks second on the World Risk Index 2020. And yeah, so I mean, this is just a brief context of the countries, the Pacific countries that we've been looking at. So again, this is a good way to show how the sharing of experiences of disaster management who have with countries similarly affected by natural hazards would offer an important avenue to address some of these constraints that Pacific Island states face. Next slide, please. Okay, so while individual countries actually face varying levels of disaster risks, most of the Southwest Pacific and Southeast Asian states actually are vulnerable to similar effects of climate change and climate-related hazards. This shared vulnerability actually raises the possibility of fostering interregional partnership between the Southwest Pacific and Southeast Asia, particularly in the realm of disaster governance, and that is the premise of our paper. So from the literature, we can actually see that more often than not, regional and international partnerships stem from the need to deal with collective action problems. States are motivated to set up regional organizations because of a rational desire to decrease the economic and human cost of future disasters. Such organizations and institutions are instrumental in providing a platform for stakeholders and policy makers to congregate and share expertise and viewpoints. And this is largely due to the fact that I think it's been argued by various scholars that the transnational nature of non-traditional security challenges, which can include disasters and climate change, is actually far too expansive for national and domestic institutions to handle on their own, and hence the need for regional and international partnerships. So, yeah, can I, next slide, please. And I think apart from rational and functional motivations for interregional partnership, there is also evidence that normative conditions in both the Southwest Pacific and Southeast Asia are favorable for such an endeavor. The most obvious manifestation of this can be seen in articulations of a common regional identity. So just as how in ASEAN we have the ASEAN Way, in the Pacific they have the Pacific Way as well, which basically emphasizes moderation, respect, consensual dialogue, and inclusiveness, which is quite similar to what ASEAN tries to promote as well. So as we can see, these common regional norms actually offer a conducive and starting point and conducive environment to develop a relationship between countries in the two regions. And moreover, I think from a constructivist point of view, constructivist approaches in international relations also argue that normative logic often drives regional processes. For instance, Ram in 2016 asserts that the diffusion of norms and concepts of disaster governance, specifically from international organizations such as the UN, can drive regional cooperation on disaster management. And Hollis in 2015 applies world society theory to regional disaster risk management efforts. And he argues that global norms can actually push regional organizations to develop humanitarian capacities. So while these theories are often applied at the state and singular regional level, I think it's the premise of our paper that we are trying to argue that this can actually be applied to an interregional cooperation or relationship as well. And I think last but not least, we can see that at least in the realm of disaster management, states seem to be more willing to cooperate. We can see this from in the immediate aftermath of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, where it provided a catalyst for the development of ADMA, which is the disaster management sort of statute in ASEAN. So I guess this indicates that there's a common understanding among governments about the need regarding shared vulnerabilities, as well as the need to collectively come together to resolve these, or at least try to resolve these problems. Next slide, please. So these are some of our findings that obviously the details can be found in the paper, but this is just a summary of our findings. The findings presented in our article actually suggest that partnership between ASEAN member states as well as Pacific Island states is actually a very distinct possibility. A close reading of the text of two recent regional declarations, the first one being the Declaration on Institutionalizing the Resilience of ASEAN and its communities and peoples to disasters and climate change, as well as the Boe Declaration on Regional Security. So these two, close reading of these two texts actually reveals many similarities in terms of policy direction and priorities in disaster governance, and I will discuss more of this later. Along with their shared vulnerabilities and challenges, there is actually room to consider the viability of interregional partnership between the two regions. For instance, ASEAN's one ASEAN and one response vision of responding to disasters as one, inside and outside the region, could actually be applicable to the context of the Southwest Pacific. ASEAN member states can actually explore how this can be realized. And the ASEAN Vision 2025 on disaster management, which is what charts the strategic direction of ASEAN's disaster management mechanisms, also lays out the importance of forming stronger traditional and non-traditional partnerships. So I mean, what we feel is that, and what we argue in our paper is that more broadly, the ASEAN community actually offers numerous entry points to engage with the Southwest Pacific on disaster governance. One example for this could be the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management, or the AHA Center, which actually offers an operational avenue to engage with the emerging regional organization in the Pacific, i.e. PIF. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as mentioned before, this is just comparison of the various regional declarations. So it actually highlights many overlapping concepts by using the same disaster risk management terminology and reference points, as well as aspiring towards similar goals. These declarations, and we argue by extension the regional organizations that they are derived from, actually can become conduits for global norms. So in the case of ASEAN and PIF, common themes in the declarations revolve around combating the effects of climate change and the impacts of natural hazards, and also as well as strengthening knowledge sharing processes. So these common themes and norms arguably provide the impetus for interregional partnership. Despite the different local customs, traditions, and political systems of both the Southwest Pacific, of states in the Southwest Pacific and Southeast Asia, the similarity in terms of goals, language, and disaster governance structures actually establishes an environment that is conducive for fostering interregional partnerships. And also, I guess as a final note, there has also been historical precedent of more bilateral engagements between Southeast Asian states and Pacific Island states. For example, in 2015, Indonesia sent $2 million worth of humanitarian aid to Vanuatu, which was devastated by Cyclone Pam. And more recently, I think just last year, in the aftermath of Cyclone Harold, Indonesia has also sent in-kind humanitarian aid to Fiji. So all of this bodes well, right? The stage seems well set up for more sustained engagement between states from both regions and at a more collective regional level. And this bodes well for future interregional partnerships. So I think that's all for my portion. I'd like to hand it back to Al. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Next slide, please. Can we go one more? So what we identified in our interviews, both in the region and in the Southwest Pacific, were some of these normative opportunities. So as Chris has outlined there, that we have agreements which broadly are in tune with one another, and particularly in these two regions, which are both exposed to natural hazards, more so than other regions of the world. We've also found that the local knowledge that has been generated through this exposure offers ways and means for each region or each state in the two respective regions to share their experience in order to build a more resilient society through a common platform. We've also seen, as Chris had mentioned, those bilateral ties have already been developed, and the Philippines also has been instrumental in this in terms of some of the responses to natural hazards in the past decade. In terms of the operational aspects of what are those policy takeaways, what we found was that there is an emerging role for what they call lists of experts. So where we have, particularly in the Southwest Pacific, where states simply don't have the domestic capacity to train the required number of personnel, that if they look at it in terms of regional capacity, then the knowledge and technical expertise can be shared in the region. And this is something that we can see happening as well in Southeast Asia, and there being overlaps there in how they can go about building up a regional capacity to respond to natural hazards. We've also seen the establishment within ASEAN of a number of training programs, and there is potential there within the One ASEAN, One Response to open up participation to more than ASEAN member states only. We've also seen as well, in terms of the development of regional capacities, of Camp Blackrock in Fiji, which is funded largely by Australia and New Zealand, but is going to be focused on HADR and peacekeeping. And we've seen within our region, both in terms of the AHA Centre and the regional HADR Coordination Centre in Changi, as having potential areas of operational overlap. So there are a number of entry points in the policy realm that could foster a more common platform for these two regions exposed to natural hazards, particularly as we enter 2021 with the recent discussion at the UN Security Council on climate change 2 days ago, and then later on this year we have the COP meeting. And we have an opportunity here for these regions to have a stronger voice if they're acting together. Next slide, please. However, recent developments in the Pacific have shown that nothing is a given. And with the recent meeting to elect the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, we saw the removal, the individual resignation of Micronesian states from the regional grouping. So what I'll do here is to talk about what this means in terms of what we've argued in the paper. Essentially what had happened was that there was an informal agreement that the Pacific Islands Forum Secretary General would be rotated around the 3 sub-regions of the Pacific Islands, that being Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia. Micronesia hadn't had its turn, and it had gone to another sub-region instead of going to it. And the vote was very close. It was split basically by 9 votes to 8 votes, with the Marshall Islands not voting. And so what had happened is that has really earlier on this year, just earlier on this month, has really set in motion a series of developments that have caused the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea to start some shuttle diplomacy to try and resolve this. They essentially have 1 year to try and resolve the issue with the Micronesian states in order for them not to formally leave the organization. And he's attempting to do this through the Pacific way, which is in terms of finding consensus on an alternative candidate that everyone can agree on. So why did that come about? One of the reasons given for this is that usually at these regional meetings, they're held in person. And so a lot of dialogue goes on informally around the meeting and they come to an agreement. But this year, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was held on Zoom. And so the informal interactions between member states of the Pacific Islands Forum wasn't there. And this led to what we saw being the split vote. Next slide, please. So why do I think that the argument still holds? Essentially what we're seeing in both regions, and we've explained that both of them are exposed to natural hazards, and there is essentially a normative commitment to responding collectively to the threat of natural hazards. So even beyond the institution, we are seeing that regional way to disaster governance emerge. And it's recognized in the Bowie Declaration on Regional Security in the Pacific here, which is recognizing that something external to the local politics is the greatest challenge there, and that being climate change and natural hazards. Importantly, as Chris had mentioned earlier, is that we're also looking at a regional compatible expansion of the concept of security, which is consistent to what we see in Southeast Asia, which includes these issues such as human security, environmental and resource security in the area that we're focused on in our study. Next slide, please. So ultimately, what are we seeing here? That there are a number of takeaways that we need to consider when looking at into regional partnerships and their prospects. One is the domestic and local political environment. So despite there being a collective action problem in the Pacific, also all politics is local, and the relationships between the sub-regions have a long history, and the local customs and political dynamics have often been fraught with periodic episodes of disagreement, as we've seen earlier this month. In terms of the relationships between the sub-regions in the Pacific, that was seen in the meeting on the appointment of the new Secretary General, that there are a lot of challenges and expectations in informal political environments, which have been really affected by the shift to online working. We've also seen during the past year the external shocks of a pandemic, of COVID-19, which has really impacted the ability in both Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific to respond to natural hazards. But essentially, I think the main point that we wanted to make in this paper is that as a region, as two regions that neighbor one another and are exposed to natural hazards, there is a unity in diversity for a collective action problem in order for the issues and challenges that we face in both these regions on a global stage. And so the argument for interregional cooperation or partnership is stronger as we face the onset of climate change and the impacts that will have on the speed and scale of natural hazards.
Thank you very much, Al and Chris, for a very interesting discussion, and also the opportunity of actually sharing the findings of your paper, which has since been published by the Pacific Review. I would now like to open the discussion, questions and discussion. So we have actually, I'm looking at that. So if you have questions, we have the chat line, and I can sort of read your questions or cluster them and present them to Chris and Al. But I would like to exercise the prerogative of the chair to push the two speakers to tell us or let us know, while the paper actually examined prospects for cooperation, given that there are members in one region, the Southwest Pacific, seen through the Pacific Island Forum, that are actually already engaging bilaterally with countries in ASEAN, and at the same time, are actually also extending assistance to ASEAN. So the question is, are there indications of already active engagement among the members of the PIF with ASEAN? That's one question from me. And the second is a question here talking about, asking about the cooperation, not just on the operational side of disasters, but on the causes of natural hazards, so to speak, including, for example, deforestation, all the other mitigating elements to prevent natural hazards. So that's a question. So there are two there. And I think let's start with that first. So whoever wants to respond, Al or Chris.
Yeah, sure. I can take the question on whether or not there's currently interregional cooperation. Is that okay? Yeah.
No, engage, it doesn't have to be in both regional, but already indications of that happening since there are members of the PIF. I'm talking about Australia, New Zealand, for example, that are actively engaged with ASEAN. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, yeah, as we mentioned, there are really bilateral engagements, right? So, but I think as Al mentioned, it's the need to band together and come together to solve a bigger collective action problem. I think it's a higher order imperative, I guess. That's what my response would be to it. And I mean, I guess this leads into the question as well as whether or not is there interregional cooperation in other issues such as deforestation, massive flooding. As far as I know, a lot of it is it's just discussion in forums, like for example, in the Strategic Policy Dialogue on Disaster Management in 2019, we had a representative from the Pacific Island Forum, the former Secretary General, Dame Meg Taylor. So she represented, the Pacific and on one of the panels. But as far as I know, I think that's the extent to which the engagement has been. So largely in networking sessions and panel discussions. So I think what we're trying to argue in this paper is that maybe there are more, at least from a more operational perspective, there is actually room for greater engagement and just moving beyond bilateral engagement, which is just simply providing aid, right? But if you go back to that table where we provided, there's actually a lot of opportunity for joint training programs, for the exchange of knowledge, for what was it? The exchange of personnel, for example. That could be a way of doing it as well. Like in ASEAN, we have the ASEAN ERAT team, and then in the Pacific, they are trying to create a facility to train their to build up the capacity of the humanitarian assistance capacity of their own people. So I mean, there could be potential overlaps such as these. So I guess that's my sort of short answer to the question you raised. Thank you.
Okay, I can answer the other one. There are a number of forums and collective action problems that we see in terms of broader issues of climate change and prevention mitigation activities. So they're already ongoing. The focus of our paper was on responses to quick onset disasters that we've seen in the exposure to tropical cyclones and typhoons in the respective region as two examples, and how that offers an opportunity for there to be a point for collaboration between those two regions of Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific. There are, so in short, there are other activities that are ongoing, potentially broader issues, but our focus in this was looking at the response capacity in that the element of humanitarian assistance.
Okay, thank you for that. I guess you could continue with that conversation about interregional, indications of interregional cooperation, with this question about why has there not yet been substantive cooperation. So that's the sort of part two to that question. I guess you can deal with that later on. But there are two interesting questions here. You talked about in your last slide, second to the last slide, I think, Al, when you said there's unity and diversity, unity. So a question here from is what do you mean by that? Can you elaborate on that? And related to the question is what happens if there are cracks within each of this organization? For example, as you've discussed the issue about the selection of the head of the PIF, where Micronesia, if Micronesia, for example, leaves the PIF, is that going to be, would it impact on potential collaboration between these two countries? So it doesn't have to be that. It could also be what happens in ASEAN when there are frictions, right, within or cracks within. Is that going to impact on this too? So in a way, you could talk about how do you actually therefore promote unity of purpose when there are cracks that's happening from within. So over to you.
Sure. Thanks very much for the questions. I mean, in terms of unity and diversity, what we're, I think, looking at here is that despite those differences, that there is a common threat to the states and societies in both regions, and that being quick onset disasters. And so with that common threat across those countries, so despite those domestic differences, there is a need to respond together as countries face these disasters, whether it is a tropical cyclone or typhoon. And so what does it mean in terms of regional organizations? I think we need to be thinking more broadly, because we've looked at the normative element here. And so I think my reply to this would be that we're not just looking at a traditional institutionalist view of what constitutes a region. So a region is more than a regional institution. So it is a way of cooperating together. And it is through those common elements of how the regions respond to these issues that we identified the overlaps. And so whilst the Pacific Islands Forum and indeed ASEAN may have internal membership dynamics and issues, I think that the common security threat of exposure to natural hazards means that despite those institutional difficulties, we will see still cooperation persisting as they face those common security threats.
I don't see any more questions. Are there more?
Actually, yeah, I can.
Oh yeah, sorry, this one. Oh, Chris, you want to come in here?
Yeah, I can take the question from Lena about why has there not been substantive cooperation? Yeah. I mean, I guess one of the challenges, so to speak, in terms of any new partnership or regional or cooperation at a greater level is that like how do you determine the extent of the partnership, like, and what form it should take? And I think this is one of it's one of the obstacles, at least at the initial stages of this process. So while obviously we see that the two regional blocs have aligned interests in terms of combating climate change and dealing with disaster, dealing with the effects of disasters, but I think the member states have vastly different. Both sets of member states have very vastly different capabilities, and so it's very difficult to. I guess my answer to it would be that it's very difficult to have a equal footing partnership at the onset, and like it runs the risk of maybe some states might or one grouping might want more say in the matter, and or rather they might want a patron-client relationship in that way, which will obviously is very problematic in terms of building relations at a regional level. And so that's one point. And I guess the other point is that yes, while we do see that the normative environment is quite conducive for interregional partnership, right? I think one of the caveats is that there could be actually a significant gestation period in terms of how long it takes before the partnerships can get kickstarted and get off the ground, because we don't know for sure whether or not, or rather it's very difficult to measure whether for a declaration, for example, whether it can actually generate significant normative change and which can actually be turned into any form of tangible outcome or action. So I think and without this tangible like political buy-in from all the member states, right? It would be very tough to envision collaboration between both regional blocs. So again, I guess so these are just like a few of the issues that maybe is actually what's preventing substantive cooperation currently. Yeah, thank you.
And I'll just add on here to that question. I mean, what we have seen, and this isn't just limited to Southeast Asia or the Southwest Pacific, is as countries begin levels of cooperation with neighboring states, that they often focus on what people often refer to as low-hanging fruit, and responses to natural hazards is one area where there is that common element across and between countries to respond to that challenge, that security challenge. So they have been doing it, and it is often the starting point, not the end point of cooperation and partnership. So I think the prospects here in terms of interregional partnership is essentially us pointing out that the low-hanging fruit between these two regions would be in this realm, because there is that common bond and common exposure to natural hazards. And in terms of what are they actually doing, we often see these regions, both internally, but also it could be interregionally, are technical responses or exercises between militaries which are already ongoing, and these usually form a platform for building interpersonal relations and building up trust between countries. So I think the prospect for these responses is at that stage, and so it's harder to predict how broader and deeper such a partnership would go at this point. But I think what we're seeing in terms of the exposure to natural hazards is a willingness in both regions to find better ways of responding to those threats.
Thank you. We normally focus, when we talk about regional cooperation, there's always the tendency to look at it from the state, state to state cooperation. But there's a question here from Julius, where which looks at the extent of knowledge sharing, resource sharing, or sharing of good practices among non-state actors or humanitarian organizations, local NGOs among one, the Pacific Islands among themselves, and second, selected ASEAN countries and Pacific Island states. So what is the extent of that? Any indication? And another question, and while you chew on that, is, when you're talking about partnership and collective or cooperative action, there's a question from BB, which is, how will the country's view of their sovereignty and hegemony hamper their willingness to enter into partnership on humanitarian efforts? So 2 questions there for you. Let's start with the non-state actors, and then we go to the view on hegemony and sovereignty. Thanks.
Chris, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I think, okay, so it's 2 parts, right? One is among Pacific Island states themselves. So in the respect, there are a couple of informal and formal networks that exist in the Pacific. So one of it is it's called Piango, which is a network of Pacific Island non-governmental organizations. So in this sense, this is the way they share their knowledge as well as share lessons learned from previous disaster responses. And also as part of PIFs, I think there are different working groups and components of PIFs that actually bring together humanitarian actors and all the different relevant stakeholders. So yeah, to share knowledge and to share resources in that extent. As for the second part, which is between ASEAN states and Pacific Island states, as far as I understand, there's not a lot of engagement so far. So like when Elle and I went over to do our fieldwork, they actually, a lot of the participants and like from academia, from the NGOs, they were very, very interested to speak to us. They were quite interested to see how they could actually bring sort of build on this relationship with us, like among researchers, right? To sort of foster ties and build bridges between people from academia from Singapore and in Fiji, for example. So I think there is a lot of potential for Southeast Asian states and Pacific Island states or rather potential for non-state actors from the two regions to actually come together and have networking sessions or build a repository of shared knowledge there. Yeah, Al?
Sure. I mean, just to add on to that point about beyond state actors, yeah, what we see in the Pacific are the limits of state capacity. And so where the state is not accessing remote islands or remote communities, that they are reliant on community bodies, whether it is, mostly we saw this coming in the form of faith-based groups. So the Free Wesleyan Church in Tonga had a very strong network. We also saw the Church of the Latter-day Saints having a very strong network there. So in the Southwest Pacific, church activity was absolutely essential part of the response. And there was a strong network across the region, and Chris mentioned the regional organization Piango, which is essentially a faith-based group organization. We also see the sharing beyond, it's not just faith-based groups, but you also see groups revolving around a particular issue. So for example, disability, there's been a great issue with the responses not being for people with disabilities in terms of evacuation shelters and so on. So there's been community group that has formed there in order to lobby and inform the development of appropriate responses. So it is beyond the state in terms of that, and often we see these people-to-people exchanges being the ties that bind countries and communities beyond the boundaries of what is constituted as Southeast Asia or the Southwest Pacific. So they are bigger in that sense in the mind. And the second one was over the sovereignty and hegemony. Why would states do it? I mean, what we've seen here in Southeast Asia is that states have become much stronger in governing this space, and often we see them identifying ways in which relief providers are able to engage in a response effort. For example, in the Sulawesi earthquake, tsunami, and liquefaction response, there the Indonesian government identified 6 core areas that people could contribute, and so we are seeing states identifying where those needs are. It's not just come one, come all, and impose your whatever it is you're supplying onto the local population. That there is much more recognition and a formula now in place, at least in Southeast Asia, to identify what those needs are and how they can be met by those external providers. So I don't think when we're looking at response to natural hazards that we're really talking about issues of hegemony, because it tends to be an emergency and a crisis period where states are looking for support to their populations.
Thank you. There's a question here from Charlie Brown on military to military HIDR cooperation. What are the areas for improvement? I suppose in this is among or between them, or each respective region. I'm not sure where this refers to actually, but also it's an expanded question. Are there previous lessons learned which have been institutionalized, or is there a limit to how much progress occasional mil-to-mil HIDR engagement can be achieved? And can lessons learned in ASEAN apply to Pacific islands, or are there fundamental differences? So yeah, I guess if you want to summarize that, if when it comes to mil-to-mil cooperation in ASEAN, is there something that's could there be areas of improvement, and what about in the other region, and can lessons be shared between the two? So who'd like to take that?
Sure, I can chip in here. I mean, what we've seen across the Asia Pacific is the development of the RCGs, the Regional Consultative Group on Humanitarian Civil Military Coordination, which includes both Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands as a platform for civil military engagement. And more recently, in the last couple of years, we have seen a greater focus on the Pacific in terms of how they've been responding to disasters. And I think the two key differences here is that structurally in the Pacific, we see much more prominence given to the police in states where they don't have standing militaries. So the countries we've looked at actually all have standing militaries, being Tonga, Fiji, and Papua New Guinea in an earlier fieldwork. And the military-to-military cooperation there, we have seen them sharing lessons and also expanding the concept of civil-military relations to include the police. So now the discussion revolves around civil-military-police relations and how they are able to cooperate in response to natural hazards. So there've been quite a few lessons, and I think that so that space seems to have broadened by the engagement of those two of Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific, and hopefully that's a tangible example of where it's happening. Just quickly on lessons learned. I mean, we want everyone to learn lessons, right? But often they're just observed and they're not usually put into practice. So, I mean, there is a need for a repository in that sense, and And hopefully that's, part of the work that that academia can contribute is by providing those assessments and also looking at the areas for improvement for the next disaster response.
Yeah, just to add on there, yeah, as El mentioned, like, so I think with the exception of Papua New Guinea, or I think only Fiji and Tonga have standing militaries, and we see that like in joint exercises in the Pacific region, it's only the militaries from Fiji and Tonga, and most of the time it's with the Australian and New Zealand militaries, where they have all these joint exercises on HADR, on humanitarian assistance disaster response operations. So I think in that sense, that's where sort of our paper comes in, and we are trying to argue that perhaps there's a need to expand this sort of grouping to include Southeast Asian states as well. I mean, due to shared vulnerability as well as geographical proximity as well. Yeah, so that's just to add on to Al's point.
Are there more questions that are forthcoming? Or I don't, have I missed out on anything? I think I've read most of the questions. Okay, maybe before I turn over the the floor to the two other speakers, I just wanted to perhaps add my thoughts in here. In that I think it's a very, very useful exercise to really examine prospects of cooperation between the two regions, as the Al and Chris have actually indicated. In spite of differences in culture, etc., there's actually a common tie. There are common ties that bind these two regions together. If anything, is really the shared vulnerabilities to to this kind of natural hazards, and really the need, the common interest to improve capacity and other things. And I guess if I could comment on the question that was raised earlier about sovereignty and hegemony, I mean, it's always, it's a very interesting question, because do these two, sovereignty as a norm, does it actually prevent countries from collective action or collective cooperation? And as we have seen, in spite of the fact that there are really, really serious concerns about sovereignty, especially when you have foreign forces coming into your country and undertaking emergency relief and operation, and it can cause some disquiet. But the overarching need, is there, and that one way is, of course, that sovereignty issues are set aside, because after all, HADR, particularly when it comes to military operations, they don't stay for long. They're the first one and first in, first out, right? So the overarching, that common need, that common vulnerability is one that could actually soften concerns or smoothen concerns of sovereignty. But in the context of regions, actually, another element is, when you look at sovereignty, is instead of looking at it on its own, you're actually looking at the pooling of sovereignties. And that's the reason why there are regional security complexes, right? That it's the pooling of sovereignty that then enhances capacities of states. And in fact, if you look at it from the perspective of responsibility to protect, you're able to maintain your sovereignty if the state is able and willing to actually protect its people from all sorts of vulnerabilities. And on the question, I guess, of why is there no substantive cooperation as yet? I'm sure it's in the paper, but we also have to recognize that although when you talk about it in terms of distance from ASEAN, ASEAN countries, it's if you're from Indonesia, then Australia is not too far away, but the other parts of the Pacific are actually quite far and also quite remote. There's a question of connectivity, right? I think I don't know how long it took Chris and Al to actually move from one island to the other. So it is in this kind of, identifying areas where you can sort of bridge this distance is, I think, a very useful exercise that this paper has actually tried to examine. And perhaps when you look at the role of individual countries in this region, another area to perhaps examine is if you have two different regions, but in one region, which is the Pacific Island, or you have actually certain actors that are also actively engaged in ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand, for example. I mean, could there be, could these countries act as bridges to strengthen or to hasten the cooperation between these two regions? Because you have two different regions. Can there be states that can act as bridges to these two regions? I guess that's all I could add. So I'll turn over to Al and Chris for final words before we conclude this webinar. Al?
Chris, do you want to go first?
Yeah, or Chris, yeah, you first.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess as a final closing statement, I guess, I mean, we've been talking about military to military in our discussions, right? But I mean, another important aspect of opportunity for cooperation actually lies in the private sector and as well as the financial systems. So, like currently, Singapore is actually hosting SEADRIFT, which is the Southeast Asian region's first catastrophe risk facility. So that's hosted in Singapore, and I think this is actually a very good initiative that can actually dovetail with the Pacific equivalent, which is PCRAFI. So yeah, I mean, with all this push towards disaster risk modeling and reinsurance and whatnot, yeah, there are definitely other multiple avenues for engagement, and not only just in terms of just responses or military to military initiatives. Yeah, so I guess that's my closing sort of statement. Thank you.
And Al?
Sure, thank you. I mean, I guess on reflection here, one of the areas and one of the questions actually pointed to what are those tangible avenues for cooperation. And we have seen, and I'd mentioned RCG, but we also have seen other significant players like the United States playing a big role in both regions through, they have the Pacific Partnership, which identifies a number of select countries in Southeast Asia and also Pacific Islands. So we've seen that, but I think one of the larger questions we're seeing by all the activities by dialogue partners in Southeast Asia or partners in the Pacific is what is being included in these partnerships. And we've talked about other issues of mitigation through to economic development and infrastructure building. So I think it's important to identify where the strengths are and the relative contributions that can be made in both those regions. And so one of the ways that we found was through the disaster response realm as being an area where there was less burden on the partnership for ulterior motives in encouraging cooperation. So I think that in reflection, that would be where I would see the prospects here, particularly in disaster governance, being the greatest because of the minimal potential for ulterior motives in cooperation.
Thank you very much to our two speakers and also to all of you that have tuned into this webinar. It's really wonderful for us to be able to do this sharing in spite of the fact that we're going to do this face to face. So it leaves me now to really thank all of you, particularly to Chris and Al for sharing their research with us. There will be more of this kind of webinars that we will organize from the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies, as some of our colleagues will also be sharing some of their research findings. So I would like to invite all of you to keep a lookout to some of our activities. And with that, thank you and have a good evening ahead.